I didn't believe the legend until it followed me home. It's easy to say that now, sitting here where it's safe, but I want you to really think about the last time you were driving or walking alone on a back road and the silence felt a little too heavy. We all have that skeptical layer of armor. We tell ourselves that ghost stories are just campfire entertainment or clever marketing for a tourist town. We've seen the movies, we've read the Washington Irving story in middle school, and we've convinced ourselves that the Headless Horseman is just a piece of American folklore, as harmless as a Halloween decoration. But Sleepy Hollow isn't just a setting in a book. It's a real place, with real soil and real shadows that don't behave the way they should. You see, some legends fade with time, losing their teeth as the decades pass, but others, they stay. They stay because they're not just memories, they're waiting. They're woven into the very geography of the Hudson Valley, tucked between the roots of ancient oaks and the stones of the old Dutch church. I want you to imagine you're there right now. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and that peculiar blue-gray mist begins to roll off the river, blurring the lines between the road and the forest. In Sleepy Hollow, the air has a weight to it, a damp chill that seems to carry the scent of old wood and wet earth. It's in this silence that you realize the first rule of the valley, a warning that has outlasted every generation since the Revolution. If you hear a horse at night, don't turn around. It sounds like a cliché until you actually hear it. Not the rhythmic trot of a carriage horse or the distant sound of a farm animal, but a heavy, frantic gallop that resonates in your chest before it ever reaches your ears. It's the sound of iron shoes striking stone with a violence that feels personal. People think the horror of the horseman is his appearance, but the true terror is his inevitability. They say he has no head, and yet, somehow he sees. He doesn't need eyes to track the vibration of your fear. When you're out there on those narrow, winding colonial roads where the trees lean over like they're trying to whisper secrets, you start to feel it, that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you that you aren't the only thing moving through the dark. You try to tell yourself it's the wind, or perhaps a deer in the brush, but the sound of the hoofs keeps pace with your heartbeat. It's a pursuit that doesn't end at the town line. That's the thing about a legend that follows you. It doesn't care about boundaries. It doesn't care that it's the 21st century. The dread is historical, a deep, ancestral recognition that something from a darker, bloodier time is still claiming the right of way. We like to think we've outgrown these fears, but when that fog thickens and the sound of a rider begins to echo behind you, the skepticism vanishes. You're no longer a modern person with a smartphone in a car. You're just another traveler on a dark road, praying that the bridge is closer than the thing behind you. Because once you hear him, the legend isn't a story anymore. It's a shadow that's decided you belong to it. To truly understand why this legend refuses to die, you have to stop thinking of Sleepy Hollow as a character in a book and start seeing it as a physical place that exists on a map. I think that's where most people get tripped up. They assume that because Washington Irving wrote a famous story, the whole thing is just literary. But if you've ever actually driven north of New York City, past the glass towers and the highway congestion, you hit a point where the landscape starts to shift. The hills get a little steeper, the trees grow thicker and more gnarled, and the air feels like it's holding on to a different century. Sleepy Hollow isn't a theme park. It's an old Dutch settlement that has been marinating in its own shadows since the 1600s. When you stand in the middle of the old Dutch burying ground, looking at those crumbling sandstone markers with their winged skulls and weathered Dutch inscriptions, you realize you aren't standing in a tourist trap. You're standing in a graveyard that was already ancient when the American Revolution broke out. You have to understand the geography of this place to understand the fear. It's a town built on a series of deep, wooded ravines and narrow paths that wind alongside the Picantico River. Even today, with all our modern streetlights and GPS technology, there are pockets of that valley where the cell service drops to zero and the canopy of oaks and maples is so dense that the sun seems to set 20 minutes earlier than it does anywhere else. It's a natural amphitheater for echoes. In the colonial era, this was known as the neutral ground, but don't let the name fool you. It wasn't peaceful. It was a lawless, violent no-man's land between the British lines in the south and the American lines in the north. It was a place where neighbors hunted neighbors, where cowboys and skinners, marauding bands of guerrilla fighters roamed the woods looking for someone to rob or hang. This isn't just spooky atmosphere. This is the literal soil the legend grew out of. The ground is soaked in a history of ambush and sudden, violent death. Now, think about the famous church. It's still there, sitting on a rise overlooking the road. It's a small, sturdy building with walls 2 feet thick, built to withstand the elements and, perhaps, things that wander in the night. The road that passes it today follows the same basic path as the old King's Highway. When you walk that stretch of road at dusk, you start to notice things. You notice how the wind whistles through the bridge pilings in a way that sounds suspiciously like a sharp intake of breath. You notice how the shadows of the branches don't just sit still, they seem to reach. This isn't just your imagination playing tricks. It's the weight of a town's history pressing down on you. There's a question that locals have been asking for over 200 years, and it's one I want you to really consider. Did the story create the legend, or did the legend inspire the story? Most people assume Washington Irving just sat down and invented the Headless Horseman to sell books. But the truth is much more unsettling. When Irving moved to the area as a teenager to escape a yellow fever outbreak in the city, he didn't bring the ghost with him. He found it there. He spent his afternoons listening to the old Dutch housewives and the weathered farmers who had lived through the war. They were the ones who whispered about the galloping Hessian. They spoke about a real soldier, a mercenary whose head was carried away by a stray cannonball during the Battle of White Plains, and how his body was recovered and brought back to the cemetery in Sleepy Hollow to be buried in an unmarked grave. The locals were reporting sightings of a headless rider long before Irving ever dipped his pen in an inkwell. They described the sound of a horse at a full gallop in the dead of night, the sight of a dark figure leaning forward in the saddle, searching the ditches for something he'd never find. When you realize that the story is actually a report of what people were already seeing, the whole vibe of the town changes. It's no longer a quaint piece of folklore. It becomes a lingering haunting. The isolation of the valley, the narrowness of the bridges, and the deep, damp woods create a perfect environment for something to stay trapped. It makes you wonder if the town itself is a sort of stone tape replaying a moment of absolute terror over and over again. When you're there, you don't feel like you're reading a book. You feel like you're being watched by the very geography that birthed the nightmare. The hills aren't just hills, they're hiding spots. The roads aren't just pavement, they're the horsemen's hunting grounds. And the deeper you go into the history of the place, the more you realize that the legend might just be the most honest thing about Sleepy Hollow. I want you to put yourself in the driver's seat for a moment. Imagine you've stayed a little too late at a friend's house, or maybe you lingered too long at one of those old taverns near the edge of town. It's well past midnight, and the world has gone completely quiet. You're driving down one of those winding, 2-lane roads that cut through the heart of the hollow. Your headlights are the only things fighting back the dark, but they feel weak, like the shadows are actually pushing back against the beams. Then, the fog rolls in. This isn't the light, misty fog you're used to. It's thick, heavy, and white, clinging to the pavement like a wet blanket. You slow down, your hands tightening on the steering wheel because you can barely see 10 feet in front of your hood. That's when you hear it. At first, you think it's a mechanical issue, maybe a rhythmic knocking in your engine, or a flat tire thumping against the asphalt. But as you roll down your window, just a crack to listen, the sound becomes unmistakable. It's the heavy, percussive strike of iron on stone. Clack, 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 clack. It's a gallop, fast and frantic, and it's coming from the darkness, just beyond the reach of your taillights. You check your rearview mirror, expecting to see the glowing eyes of a modern car, but there's nothing but a wall of gray mist. Yet the sound is getting louder. It's vibrating through the frame of your car, a deep, resonant drumming that feels like it's matching the rhythm of your own racing heart. You try to tell yourself it's just an echo, or maybe a local farmer out way too late, but then you see a shape. Off to the right, pacing you through the dense thicket of trees, is a shadow darker than the night itself. It's huge. It moves with a terrifying fluidity, navigating the uneven, wooded terrain as if it were a flat highway. You catch glimpses of it between the trunks of the ancient oaks. A massive, powerful horse, its coat as black as ink, and a rider who seems unnaturally tall. Your instinct screams at you to floor it, to get as much distance between you and that shadow as possible. You hit the gas, the engine roars, and for a second, you think you've pulled away. But then, the rider emerges from the tree line and swings onto the road right behind you. In the faint red glow of your brake lights, you see him clearly for the first time. He's broad-shouldered, draped in a heavy, windswept cloak that billows out like the wings of a predatory bird. But your eyes instinctively travel upward, searching for a face, a helmet, or even a hat. There's nothing. Where a head should be, there's only a jagged, empty space above a high, stiff collar. There's no face to read, no eyes to meet, yet you feel his gaze with a crushing intensity. It's the horror of the absolute void, the absence of a human element where one should be. He isn't shouting, he isn't making a sound at all. The only noise is the thunderous, relentless beating of those hooves on the road. You're pushing 60, 70 miles per hour on a road meant for 30, tires screaming as you take the sharp curves, but he's right there. He's not losing an inch. It's as if the distance between you is being held constant by some invisible, malicious tether. The road ahead narrows as you approach one of the old wooden bridges that cross the Pecanico. You remember the old stories, that the spirits of this valley are bound by the water, that if you can just cross the bridge, you'll be safe. You're sweating now, your breath coming in shallow gasps, staring at that bridge as if it's the gates of heaven. You're almost there. The wooden planks are just yards away. But just as your front tires hit the timber, the rider surges forward with a burst of impossible speed. He pulls alongside you, his horse's flank almost brushing against your door. You look over, paralyzed by a fear that feels like ice in your veins. He reaches into the folds of his cloak, and for a split second, you think he's reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulls out something heavy and round. Before you can even process what's happening, he whips his arm forward in a violent, overhand motion. Something large and spinning flies past your ear, narrowingly missing the glass, hurtling through the air with a terrifying weight. You don't wait to see what it was. You don't stop to check the damage. You just keep driving, heart slamming against your ribs, until the hooves finally fade into the distance and the fog begins to lift, leaving you alone in the cold, silent dawn. You'd think that after 250 years, a ghost would eventually get tired. Most legends have a shelf life. They flicker out as the world changes, as gas lamps are replaced by electricity and dirt paths are paved over with asphalt. We like to think that progress acts as a sort of disinfectant for the supernatural, that once you have streetlights and 5G, there's no place left for a headless phantom to hide. But the thing about the horseman is that he doesn't seem to care about our timeline. He's not a relic gathered in a museum. He's a recurring character in the town's history who simply refuses to take his final bow. When you look at the archives and listen to the stories passed down through families in the Hudson Valley, you start to realize that he hasn't just stayed in the past. He's been seen in every single century since the American Revolution, and the descriptions, despite the world changing around him, never vary by more than a hair. Think about the mid-1800s, decades after Washington Irving's story had become a global sensation. You'd assume any sighting back then was just someone who had read the book and had a little too much cider at the tavern. But there are letters from that era, written by serious, sober-minded people, describing the exact same thing. A massive, dark horse that made no sound until it was right on top of you, and a rider who seemed to be looking for something he could never find. There's one account of a stagecoach driver who swore his horses nearly bolted off a cliff because something tall and shadowy had emerged from the brush near the old Dutch church. He didn't mention the book. He didn't talk about Ichabod Crane. He talked about the raw, visceral fear of a presence that felt older than the colony itself. Then the 20th century arrived. The horses were replaced by Model Ts, and then by sleek muscle cars, but the horseman just adapted his hunting grounds. I've heard stories from the 1950s, the kind of stories that old-timers only tell you if you're sitting on their porch long enough for the sun to go down. They'll tell you about a night guard at one of the big estates who saw a rider silhouetted against the moon, standing perfectly still in a field where no horse should have been. The guard drew his flashlight, but the beam seemed to just die before it hit the rider. When he looked again, the field was empty, but the grass was flattened in the shape of giant hooves. What's truly chilling is the consistency. If you talk to a commuter today, someone driving home from a late shift in Tarrytown or coming up from the city, they'll describe the same silent, looming figure that the Dutch settlers saw in the 1700s. The world has moved on. We've built highways and shopping centers, but the horseman's behavior remains a fixed point in time. He is always alone. He is always at night. He is always near those specific, ancient arteries of a town, the roads that were there when the ground was still stained with the blood of the Revolution. He doesn't speak. He doesn't shout. He doesn't plead for help. He just pursues. I think we find comfort in the idea that stories change over time, that they get exaggerated and telephone gamed into something unrecognizable. It gives us an out. It lets us say, oh, that's just a myth that grew with the telling. But with the Headless Horseman, it's the opposite. The myth has stayed terrifyingly identical for hundreds of years. Whether it's 1790, 1890, or 2024, the witness reports describe a rider with broad shoulders and an empty space where a head should be, mounted on a beast that seems to run on something other than air and muscle. There's a realization that hits you when you look at all these reports side by side. Stories change, but patterns don't. We change our clothes, our technology, and our language, but whatever is riding through the hollow hasn't changed a bit. It's as if he's an anchor, tethered to that specific stretch of earth, replaying his search over and over again while the rest of us just pass through his world. When you're driving those roads now, you're not just on a modern street. You're on a timeline where he is always just a few hundred yards behind you. He is the one constant in Sleepy Hollow, a figure that has watched the forest be cleared for farms, the farms be cleared for suburbs, and the suburbs grow into the world we know today. And through all of it, he's still there, waiting for the sun to go down, so he can claim the road again. It makes you wonder, if he hasn't left after 200 years, what makes you think he's ever going to? You have to ask yourself, where does a nightmare like this actually begin? We have this human need to put a name and a face to the things that scare us, as if knowing their why somehow makes them less dangerous. In Sleepy Hollow, the official answer, the one you'll find in history books and on the plaques around town, is that he was a Hessian trooper. Now, if you aren't a history buff, the Hessians were these elite German mercenaries hired by the British during the American Revolution. They were famously brutal, professional soldiers who had no personal stake in the colonies. They were just there to do a job. The story goes that during the Battle of White Plains in 1776, one of these troopers was caught in a particularly gruesome exchange of cannon fire. Imagine the chaos of that moment, the smell of sulfur and wet wool, the screams of horses, and then in a split second, the whistling roar of a 6-pound iron ball. It didn't just kill him, it took his head clean off his shoulders. His fellow soldiers, perhaps out of some shred of grim loyalty, supposedly carried his headless body back towards Sleepy Hollow, where they buried him in an unmarked grave in the old Dutch burying ground. The legend says that every night he rises from that unconsecrated earth, flinging himself into the saddle to ride back toward the battlefield in a desperate, eternal search for the part of himself he left behind. It's a neat story, right? It has a beginning, a middle, and a tragic end. But here's the thing that should keep you up at night. When you start digging into the actual journals of the early Dutch settlers, you realize the timeline doesn't quite fit. There are whispers and accounts of a dark rider in the valley that predate the Revolutionary War by decades. This raises a much more disturbing possibility. What if the Hessian wasn't the start of the legend? What if he was just the latest skin the legend decided to wear? If you look across the ocean, you see his brothers everywhere. In Ireland, they call him the Dullahan, a headless herald of death who rides a black horse and carries his own rotting head like a lantern. In Germany, there are tales of the wild hunt, where headless riders chase the souls of the wicked through the deep forests. It makes you wonder, did the immigrants who settled this valley bring their ghosts with them in their luggage? Did they manifest this thing out of their own collective trauma and old-world fears? Or is there something about the geography of the Hudson Valley itself, those deep, damp ravines and the way the fog gets trapped in the trees, that acts as a sort of lightning rod for this specific kind of darkness? Think about the neutral ground again. This area was a meat grinder for years. It wasn't just the Hessian who died violently here, thousands did. The ground is literally soaked in the blood of people who were caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't fully understand. When you have that much concentrated agony in one place, maybe it creates a vacuum. Maybe the horseman isn't one man at all. Maybe he's a composite, a physical manifestation of all that leftover rage and sudden, unfinished business. I've often thought about why he's searching. If he's a soldier, he's looking for his head, so he can finally have the peace of a proper burial. But if he's something older, something more primal, then the search is just a cover for something much more predatory. Why would a spirit from 1776 still be active in 2024? Most ghosts are like fading photographs. They lose their detail and their energy until they eventually vanish. But the horseman seems to get stronger, more vivid, with every passing generation. It makes the Hessian story feel like a mask. We tell it because it's easier to believe in a headless soldier than it is to believe in an ancient, nameless force that has been patrolling these woods since before the first brick was laid in the colony. When you're out there on the road and you hear those hooves, you aren't just hearing a ghost from the 18th century. You're hearing a wound in time that refuses to heal. You're hearing an origin that doesn't stay dead because it was never truly alive in the way we understand it. It's an unanswered question that's been riding through the dark for centuries, and every time someone encounters it, the question just gets louder. Why is he here? And more importantly, if he ever finds what he's looking for, what happens to the rest of us? You know, when we usually talk about monsters or ghosts, we picture something chaotic, a force of nature that just destroys everything in its path like a hurricane. We imagine a slasher who kills anyone who walks into the wrong house, or a spirit that lashes out at anyone who breathes the wrong way. But the Headless Horseman, he's different. He's surgical. And honestly, that's the part that should really keep you up at night. There's a logic to him, a set of unwritten rules that he never breaks. And once you start to look at what he doesn't do, the mystery of what he actually is becomes much more unsettling. Think about this for a second. In over 200 years of sightings and stories, the horseman has never been reported to speak. Not once. No battle cries, no ghostly moans, no, I'm going to get you. Even when he's inches away from someone, there's just silence. He doesn't even seem to breathe. When you're being chased, you expect to hear the heavy panting of a horse or the grunts of a rider under strain, but witnesses say the only thing you hear is the rhythmic, mechanical thud of those hooves. It makes him feel less like a ghost and more like a program, a persistent, unstoppable force that was set in motion centuries ago and won't stop until its task is complete. The silence is a vacuum that your own fear rushes to fill. And have you noticed that he doesn't attack randomly? You never hear about the horseman crashing into a crowded tavern or galloping through the middle of a festival. He doesn't want a crowd. He waits. He waits for the lone traveler, the person who stayed too long at the office, the person who decided to take the scenic route home because they wanted some peace and quiet. He appears when you are at your most vulnerable, when there are no witnesses to tell you that you aren't crazy. It makes me wonder if he's shy, or if it's something more calculated. Maybe he needs you to be alone, so that the encounter is purely between you and him, no distractions, just the predator and the prey. Then there are the boundaries. Everyone knows the legend of the bridge, that if you can just get across the running water of the Picantico River, he'll vanish in a flash of fire and brimstone. People always ask why. Is he afraid of the water? Is it a religious thing because the bridge is near the church? But maybe it's simpler and more chilling than that. Maybe he's not forbidden from crossing. Maybe he just has no interest in what's on the other side. He is the Lord of the Hollow. He is the spirit of that specific, dark geography. Once you leave his territory, you're no longer his problem. It's like being chased by a guard dog that stops exactly at the edge of the property line. He doesn't bark. He doesn't try to pull you back. He just stands there, watching you from the shadows, making sure you know that you don't belong in his world. This brings me to a theory that some of the locals whisper about, and it's one that really changed how I look at the legend. What if the horseman isn't hunting people because he's evil? What if he's correcting something? Think about Ichabod Crane. In the original story, he wasn't exactly a hero. He was an outsider, a bit of a gold digger, a man who was trying to manipulate his way into a fortune he hadn't earned. He was a disruptor. And what did the horseman do? He chased him out. He didn't kill him, at least, not in most versions. He just removed him from the board. Maybe the horseman isn't a murderer. Maybe he's a gatekeeper. Maybe he appears to people who are carrying something they shouldn't, or people who have a darkness in them that matches the darkness of the valley. It adds a layer of moral unease to the whole thing. If you're driving down that road and you hear the hooves, you have to ask yourself, what did I do to get his attention? Are you being hunted because you're a victim, or because you're a trespasser in a place that demands a certain kind of respect? He doesn't demand your life, he demands your departure. He wants you to know that there are places in this world where the modern rules don't apply, where your logic and your technology mean nothing. He is the personification of the keep-out, sign that nature posts, but we choose to ignore. So, if you're ever in Sleepy Hollow, and you feel that heavy presence behind you, remember, he isn't going to talk to you, he isn't going to explain himself, and he isn't going to follow you into the light. He's just going to show you exactly how fast you can run when you realize you aren't the top of the food chain anymore. It's not about the kill. It's about the reminder. And that, I think, is a much more haunting thought to carry home with you. You see, Sleepy Hollow today is a bit of a contradiction. If you go there in October, it's all orange lights, hay rides, and gift shops selling plastic pumpkins and Headless Horseman sweatshirts. It's a festival atmosphere, a Disney-fied version of a nightmare. But if you talk to the people who actually live there, the ones whose families have been in the Hudson Valley for generations, the vibe changes once the tourists go home and the decorations come down. They don't treat the horseman like a mascot. They treat him like a neighbor you don't want to piss off. There's a set of unwritten rules that locals follow, not because they're playing a part for the cameras, but because they've seen what happens when you don't. It's the kind of practical, quiet caution you usually reserve for things like black ice or riptides. You don't brag about it, you just do it. The first rule is simple. You don't stop on the roads that line the cemetery or the woods after the streetlights start to flicker. We've all been there. You're driving, you think you see something in the brush, and your instinct is to hit the brakes and see if it was a deer or a coyote. In Sleepy Hollow, you don't do that. If you see a shape that's too tall or too dark, you just keep driving. You keep your eyes locked on the white line of the pavement, and you move. There's this specific stretch of Route 9, and some of the smaller, winding paths like Sleepy Hollow Road, where the fog doesn't just sit, it flows. It comes off the river in these long, finger-like tendrils that seem to reach across the asphalt. The locals know that when that fog gets thick enough to swallow your high beams, that's when the glitches start to happen. I've heard stories from late-shift workers and commuters who describe their modern technology failing in ways that don't make sense. We're talking about brand-new cars, high-tech SUVs with all the bells and whistles, suddenly losing power near the old Dutch church. The dash lights go dark, the engine stutters, and the GPS starts spinning in circles as if it's lost its connection to the sky. And in that silence, when the hum of the heater dies and the world goes cold, that's when they hear it. The sound of something heavy moving through the leaves just a few feet from their window. They don't reach for their phones to record it. Why? Because there's a visceral, lizard brain fear that tells them that if they try to catch him on a screen, he'll have a reason to stay. And that brings me to the most unsettling part of the modern legend. We live in an age where everything is documented, right? Everyone has a camera in their pocket. We have dash cams and Ring doorbells and drones. So why isn't there a definitive video of the horseman? The locals will tell you it's because he isn't a physical object you can just photograph like a car crash. He's a tear in the fabric of the place. When people do catch something, a blurry shape, a dark mass that shouldn't be there, they usually end up deleting it. They don't share it on Reddit. They don't try to go viral. There's a weight that comes with seeing him, a psychological heaviness that makes you want to distance yourself from the experience as fast as possible. I once spoke to someone who lived near the edge of the woods, and they told me about a neighbor who had ignored the warnings. This guy was a skeptic, a city person who thought the stories were just fun local color. He went out one night during a particularly heavy fog, laughing about how he was going to find the ghost. He didn't disappear. He didn't get dragged into the underworld. He came back about an hour later, parked his car, and walked into his house. But he was different. He stopped coming to the local diner. He stopped waving to people. When someone finally asked him what he saw near the bridge, he just looked right through them with eyes that seemed like they'd been bleached of all their color. He didn't say a word. He just moved away a month later, leaving half his furniture behind. That's the modern warning. The horseman doesn't always take your head. Sometimes he just takes your peace. He leaves you with a silence that you can't ever seem to fill again. The last people who ignored the warning didn't vanish into thin air, they just never talked about it again. They carry that encounter like a secret they're afraid will get out if they breathe too loudly. So, if you're ever in town and the sun starts to drop, and you see a local picking up their pace or pulling their car into the garage a little faster than usual, don't laugh. They aren't afraid of a storybook character. They're respecting a reality that's been there longer than the town itself. And if you're smart, you'll do exactly what they do. You'll go inside, you'll lock the door, and you'll stop listening to the wind. So, we're left with the quiet part. The part after the story ends and the lights are still off. And you're sitting there wondering why a story about a headless man from the 1700s still feels so heavy in your chest. It's easy to dissect history and geography when the sun is up, but as we wrap this up, I want to leave you with the one thing that truly haunts me about this whole legend. It's the idea that a headless rider doesn't need eyes to see. Think about that for a second. We rely on eyes to understand intent. We look at a person's face to see if they're angry or sad or merciful. But when you're standing in the dark and you're faced with a void where a face should be, there is no empathy. There is no recognition of your humanity. There is just a cold, focused awareness. He doesn't see you the way I see you. He sees the vibration of your fear. He sees the rhythm of your blood pumping through your veins. He sees you as a disturbance in the stillness of his valley. And that's the real unanswered question at the heart of Sleepy Hollow. What is he actually looking for? If it were just about a missing head, you'd think he would have found one by now, or at least given up after 2.5 centuries. But the riding continues. The pursuit continues. This suggests that the search isn't a goal, it's a state of being. I started this by saying I didn't believe the legend until it followed me home. And that's the hardest thing to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. You see, a legend like this isn't just a ghost trapped in a specific town. It's a parasite of the mind. Once you've stood on that bridge, once you felt the damp chill of the old Dutch burying ground, and once you've heard that phantom gallop in your mind, you've opened a door. The horseman doesn't need to physically leave Sleepy Hollow to follow you. He follows you in the way you now look at the woods behind your own house. He follows you in the way you find yourself checking the back seat of your car when you're driving alone at night. He becomes the shadow that's just a little too long, the sound in the attic that doesn't quite match the settling of the house. What if he isn't a prisoner of that valley? That's the thought that really gets under my skin. We love the idea of haunted places because it implies that the horror is contained. We think, if I just stay away from Sleepy Hollow, I'm safe. But what if he's free? What if he's an ancient, primordial force of pursuit that simply chooses Sleepy Hollow as his favorite stage? What if he's riding through every dark wood, every fog-choked back road, and every silent suburb, just waiting for someone to acknowledge him? By learning his story, by whispering his name, you essentially signal to him that you're listening. And once he knows you're listening, he knows exactly where to find you. There's a specific kind of dread that comes with an unresolved mystery. We want an ending. We want Ichabod to come back, or the Hessian to find his peace, or the town to finally be quiet. But the silence in Sleepy Hollow isn't the silence of peace. It's the silence of a predator holding its breath. The legend is still alive because the hunger is still there. Every time someone drives those roads with a smirk on their face, thinking they're too modern for ghost stories, the horseman finds a reason to ride again. He is the personification of the unknown, the literal, headless, embodiment of a world that doesn't make sense. So, here's my final piece of advice for you. If you ever find yourself in Sleepy Hollow at night, or really, any place where the trees are too thick and the fog is too heavy, don't go looking for him. Don't try to be the one who captures the perfect video or proves the skeptics wrong. Because even if you don't see him, he sees you. And he has all the time in the world to catch up. When you finish this, and you turn off your screen, and you head off to bed, pay attention to the sounds outside your window. If the wind picks up and starts to sound a little bit like a rhythmic thumping, if the shadows in the corner of your room seem to be wearing a heavy, colonial cloak, just keep walking. Don't stop. And most importantly, if you're driving home tonight and you feel that sudden, inexplicable urge to check your rearview mirror to make sure the road behind you is empty, don't do it. Some things are better left unseen. Because a headless rider might not have eyes, but he knows exactly when you're looking back at him. And that's usually when he starts to gallop. Good night, and stay off the old roads.